Alright, welcome back to another video where I'll be going through some of my final tips for the IB English exam, which are going to take place tomorrow, paper 1, and in 2 days for paper 2. So I just want to share with you some of the ways I analyze the text, and I hope you can learn and increase your grade as well. So let's get started. Let's first think about analysis foundations. So what constitutes a good analysis? Well, there are many tiers. So there are essentially 3 ingredients to analysis. The first one is to incorporate the writer's purpose. The second one is language. And the third one is the effect of that language on the audience or on the readers. So whenever we read a literary work, or even if it's not a literary work, whenever we read a text, writers always write with a purpose in their mind, be it to convey the beauty of a house, to criticize a policy, or to demonstrate why pizza is the best food. So the key fact here is that writers only put words on a page because they want to achieve a real, concrete purpose. And with this purpose, being able to communicate something quite meaningful, quite impactful, that's going to change the way you view a certain topic. And this could be like a message, an idea, or simply just a story to just elicit humor, essentially. So the lesson to take home is that the writer's purpose is absolutely central to your literary analysis. And so we can say that the message in a text is the writer's purpose, and that a writer's purpose can also be the authorial intent. So those two words are synonyms to each other. So now the question really is, how does that writer achieve the specific purpose he or she wants to achieve? And the tricky part here is through language. Language is the means by which authors achieve their purpose. You can think of it as the road between the writer's brain and the audience or the reader's brain, and that road is language. So writers themselves have to be very clever. They have to deliberately choose the right words, the right literary techniques, and even the right punctuation, like comma, end stops, stuff like that, to most effectively convey their message. So with that in mind, right, in order to analyze a text well, we have to follow the arrow between language to the meaning of that language and how that meaning constructs the writer's purpose. So whenever we see an extract, the first thing to do is to find interesting techniques in the text and explain how the meaning or the idea is constructed by the language, and explain how that idea achieves the writer's purpose. So the key fact that is very crucial for the IB is we can define literary analysis as the process of explaining or justifying a writer's choice of language and how that impacts the reader's response on that language. So the 2 basic facts we can take home is that every writer has a purpose, and that writers deliberately choose language to achieve their purpose. And now the question is on how does that language convey an effect on the reader? Because remember, we're always talking about how language affects the reader. The reader is central to literary analysis. And in fact, there are 2 different, you can group the effect on reader broadly by 2 categories. The first category is an intellectual effect, usually elicited by a rhetorical question, for example. but more often readers feel an emotional effect. For example, we might feel shocked when we read a war poem, or we might feel sympathized with the narrator or the speaker. And to describe the effect on the reader, there are I can give like examples of some sad words or some happy words. Like sad words include like death, isolation, grey skies, abandonment, failure, and happy words are like celebration, pride, birthday, achievement, stuff like that. So the emotional effect of language is often used by writers to reinforce this abstract idea or message. And moving on, let's talk about the method I normally use to analyze a quote. So the first thing I would do is identify, state the technique used in a particular quote. And the second step is to explain how that technique creates a deeper meaning or idea. That's what we always want to think about. And moving on, we'd look at and explain how this idea in turn achieves the writer's purpose. Remember, now we're going back to the purpose, why the writer does what he or she does. And then, after we've explained the authorial intent, we're going back to state the effect on the reader, on the audience, and also explain how the effect on the reader also achieves the writer's purpose. And so let's get into some of the analysis foundations now. So let's actually talk about a little bit about the paper one, what it's just given you like a gist of how to approach it. So a paper one is basically an exam where you're given two unseen extracts, and for standard level students you can choose one extract, one out of the two. For higher level students you choose two, obviously, and in the essay that you're going to write, it's split into three parts. First part is introduction, second part is body, and third part is conclusion. So, as a general overview, the introduction is basically an easy task of introducing the subject statement, right? And the body paragraphs is where all the hard work goes into, where you want to support, develop, and prove the main argument, and then the conclusion summarizes everything that you've already said. Going to the introduction, so a good thesis statement would always show how the writer's use of language achieves the writer's overall purpose. And in the body, the job for the student is to prove the bold claim that that was made in the thesis statement, essentially. And the conclusion is just summarizing everything that was said. So a lot of people are thinking about the word count of paper one. I'd usually go for around 700 words. That is a sweet spot. So introduction should be no longer than 150 words, right? Because it just serves to introduce the key ideas of the body, and it shouldn't be that long. Now the body can be each point in the body paragraph can be around 250 to 300 words. I'd actually go towards the 250 end, because you don't have that much time in an exam condition to write many words, so it's actually easier to keep the idea succinct rather than writing a lot of words. And now I'm going to talk about the foundations to analysis, right? So a lot of people ignore tone, atmosphere, and mood, and some people also confound the concepts between those three. Actually, those three are different concepts, but they have very similar meanings. So let me clarify that. So what is a tone? So a tone is a sort of emotion that you get from reading a text. For example, in an extract, there might be an indignant tone when maybe the characters are arguing against each other, or a desperate tone when the narrator is about to miss his flight or something like that. So tone is the most useful interpretive tool. So by looking at a text, you can immediately spot whether that tone is positive or negative. Then after that, you get a sense of idea of how to analyze the extract. And so the question is, how is tone related to atmosphere and mood? Well, tone directly creates mood, and the end goal in analysis is to always explain how the tone creates a certain emotion in the reader. So you can imagine and visualize a funnel, for example, where there's all the techniques on the top, and there's a funnel, and things that come down the funnel are setting and objects, and how that relates to the atmosphere, how that creates the mood. So that's what mood is. I'm just here going to give some examples about words to describe tone here. So there are essentially a lot of tones out there, and I've grouped them into three categories. So positive, negative, or neutral tone. So like, for example, in the positive category, like when you're really getting into someone, like you can say the author used an admiring tone, affectionate tone, a loving tone. When someone's being quite nice, you can describe it as like gentle tone, kind, amiable, friendly, enthusiastic. And whenever you want to describe like a class clown, you can say the writer uses a humorous tone, ironic tone, sarcastic tone, stuff like that, right? And now we're getting into negative territory. So, for example, if we want to describe the sentiment, "I'm so much better than you," you use a disdainful tone, contemptuous tone, condescending tone. If someone's crying, you say that's melancholy, despondent, distressed, brooding, and also you can say accusatory tone, bitter tone, cynical tone, hostile tone, resentful tone, critical tone, harsh tone, etc. And also, if someone's been trying to like show off, you could say an arrogant tone, commanding, aggressive, abusive tone. Or if someone's trying to make fun of another person, you can say it's a mocking or ridiculing tone. If someone's about to, let's say, jump off a cliff, you can say that's a fearful tone, nervous tone. If someone is like this, doesn't know what to say, then you could say that's an awkward, stilted, or even like a stiff tone. And there's always like the neutral territory, like neither positive nor negative. And in that case, for example, if someone's just chill and being honest, you can say that the writer uses a conversational, candid, casual, sincere tone. If someone's like, "I'm always correct," you could say that person has a factual, matter-of-fact, certain tone. If someone's like, "Bro, who cares?" that's going to be like apathetic and nonchalant tone. And now, after we've listed so many adjectives to describe what tone is, let's move to atmosphere. So what does the atmosphere of a text mean? So a lot of people confuse mood and atmosphere, but essentially an atmosphere is the feeling of an environment as constructed by a writer's description of the environment and objects within that setting. So for example, in New York City, for example, the techniques could be like, imagine New York City was like an extract, and the honking cars and stuff are like the bustling nature is like the techniques. The atmosphere would be bustling, dynamic, or energetic, whereas the mood experienced by someone, a spectator in New York, or someone walking down the street, would be like awe, excitement. So the difference between atmosphere and mood is that the atmosphere is an external feeling coming from the physical environment, whereas the mood is the internal feeling from the reader themselves. So, having done that, let's have a look at some literary techniques. Let's talk about techniques then. So let's first talk about diction. Now, diction is the way in which an author uses specific wording to convey an effect. Essentially, it's the word choice. So, for example, you could say the writer's use of emotional diction in line 5 suggests blah blah blah, or the religious diction, such as communion, suggests blah blah blah. But the rule of thumb for analyzing diction is never analyze boring words, right? That's not the purpose of diction. Diction is an interesting word choice used by the author to achieve an effect. Another rule of thumb is that a word that's worth being analyzed is if it contains interesting connotations. So now, after talking a little bit about diction, let's move on to another interesting technique. It's called modality and imperative language. A lot of people don't actually study this technique, but I think it says a lot about how the narrator or the speaker of the poem experiences his or her life. So what I mean by modality is, let me just give you an example and you'll see. So high modality words are like, we must do this, we need to do, certainly, blah, blah, blah. Whereas low modality language is like, if we could, perhaps, things like that. So modality is an expression of the speaker's certainty. So, for example, if someone uses low modality language, that creates an uncertain tone, which makes the person seem more, for example, inferior or considered quite indecisive. Whereas if someone uses a high modality language, we can say that exudes an authoritative and certain tone, which makes the person seem more superior, arrogant, or decisive, right? So whenever we see that there is a character dynamic in relation to a character or a narrator or speaker, that's when we need to analyze modality, right? And on the other hand, imperative language is essentially an authoritative command, which is very closely related to high modality language. And when writers use like imperative language in characters' thoughts and dialogue, it is often used to construct a particular tone, which in turn is used to characterize that person. And that naturally leads us to another very closely related technique called voice. And whenever we see a shift back and forth in voices, that is when we need to analyze voice. So for those who don't know, first person voice is the use of I, second person voice is the use of you, and the third person voice is like they. And so let's analyze each of them in detail. So the first person voice is essentially an inclusive language. So it creates sort of a closer relationship between the reader and the speaker. And it brings the reader into the immediate situation of the scene. On the other hand, second-person voice sort of alienates the reader by using you and using direct address, and it creates a confronting or accusatory tone because it singles out the reader, making them feel that they did something wrong. The third-person voice is just normal voice, right? Or maybe it could be an omniscient, godlike narrator. But the real gold is when the voice changes. So, for example, when the writer suddenly transitions between first and third person, we can say, for example, first of all, the text starts off with one type of voice, such as first person, and in that case, the reader feels a sense of belonging. And then the writer uses they, which is exclusive language, when referring to other characters who might be enemies, and then we can say that this transitions from first to third person voice, as evidenced by the us versus them dynamic, building conflict and disagreement. And after brushing over some of very quickly, like tone, atmosphere, mood, voices, stuff like that, I want to talk a little about illusion. Again, that's another thing that my teachers didn't really teach us about, and I think that's quite interesting. So for those who don't know, illusion is a passing reference to a historical event, a work of literature, or a religion, or even a cultural tradition. And the illusion is often external to the current text, so it's not present in the extract itself, but it contains rich meaning to those who are familiar with that illusion. So the point really is that the illusion takes advantage of the reader's pre-existing knowledge about other areas of life in order to add extra meaning to the current piece of writing. So the advice that I would give for analyzing illusion would be first, explain the meaning, the connotations, and the ideas and feelings associated with the alluded concept, and next relate these meanings to the current situation in the text. So, for example, the allusion in divine diction amplifies the fearful tone of the narrator, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. And now we're getting to I want to talk about another technique, which is called figurative language, and that's something a lot of people are quite comfortable with, so I'm just going to brush over. Figurative language are things like metaphor, which is like direct comparison. And a note here is if that metaphor continues very long throughout the text, it's called an extended metaphor. Simile is an indirect comparison using the words like or as. And then another technique would be personification. Personification is commonly used to make the setting come to life and hence create an atmosphere or evoke emotion from the reader and hence create a certain mood. And then there's also some fancier techniques like pathetic fallacy, which is the embodiment of human emotion in a natural element like the weather or the seasons or the environment. So for example, where I live in Dublin, I can say the sky swept over Dublin, drenching the city in its sorrow. That's a use of pathetic fallacy by embodying human emotions upon the cloud. And naturally people would ask, what's the difference between personification and pathetic fallacy? Well, personification, in personification, the object that's been personified can be anything. It can be natural or man-made and can have any human characteristic, whereas pathetic fallacy can only be a natural object. So like a weather, a mountain, it can't be, let's say, your mobile phone or a computer. There's no pathetic fallacy on that. and it can only embody a human emotion, like happiness. It can't embody like beauty or personality. And now, let's talk about imagery, right? That's an absolute gold to dig in when you're reading through literary works, because imagery is essentially present nearly everywhere. And in fact, there are 7 types of imagery. Most people only know like the basics, like auditory imagery, visual imagery, but there's actually way more. There's olfactory imagery, which means the smell, tactile imagery, which is the touch, gustatory imagery, which is how the food tastes, and more advanced imagery like thermal imagery, which is like the level of temperature, kinesthetic imagery, which is about the motion, and synesthetic imagery, which is the combined effects of all the imageries. And the purpose of a writer using imagery is to create a vivid, clear mental image in the reader's mind about a particular scene. And by using the senses, the writer is able to make the words come to life. And then let's talk about symbolisms and motifs. A lot of people don't know the difference between those two, so I should explain. A symbol is essentially an object that represents an abstract idea, whereas a motif is a recurring object that author uses to develop a central theme. And then let's move on to some sound devices. Those are always interesting. So there are quite basic sound devices like alliteration, which is like the repetition of the same letter in successive words, and it elicits a certain type of feeling to reinforce an abstract idea. Now, another technique is called assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds. There's consonants, repetition of consonant sounds. Sibilants, the repetition of S or SH sounds. There's rhyme. This is like internal rhymes within the same line, or external rhymes across separate lines. There's cacophony, which is the antonym of melody. It's essentially harsh sounds. Onomatopoeia is the imitation of real sounds using words. And the purpose of that is to make the scenario come to life, thus amplifying the emotional effect on the reader. So there are also structural techniques in a poem specifically, like repetition. The purpose is to emphasize a particular idea. There's also anaphora, which is the repetition of same sounds at the start of successive clauses, and is commonly used in speeches and poems to amplify a particular tone. It is also a rhetorical technique called persuasive, which is quite persuasive, sorry. And then there's another structural technique known as listing, or a fancier way to put it is enumeration, which is basically a list of things. So, for example, you can say Sam went to the supermarket and bought apples, bananas, and pears. Right, so that's listing. And a way to, sometimes listing is quite dull, as the example vividly shows you beforehand about the apple, pears, and bananas. So sometimes you want to get fancy by saying, instead of saying listing, you can say the cumulative emphasis of something. Right, that just sounds 1,000% smarter. Now, quite specifically to poems, we have a succession of techniques. So we can focus on stanza length. So, for example, short stanza create shock, whereas long stanza create flow effect. There's also line length. Short lines can slow down the pace, and long lines speed up the pace. There's also line breaks. So line breaks are essentially spaces between different stanzas. It is used for transitions in shifting focus. There's also enjambment, which is essentially the emphasis on the last word of the line creates a flowing dynamic effect, increases the pace, and it's also a stylistic choice of the author. Now there's also end stop, which is opposite to enjambment, where there's a point that concludes a line in the poem. There's also caesura, which slows down the pace, establishes a particular tone, and has a dramatic pause. Adds a dramatic pause, which often creates a foreboding atmosphere. So then we have grammatic techniques, so things related to syntax and stuff like that. So there's sentence length we can analyze. Long sentences are persuasive. Not persuasive. Pensive, so ruminating, contemplative, sad, or stuff like that. Blah blah blah. There are plenty of adjectives you can add there. Short sentences often increase the pace, maybe the tension or the excitement, if that's relevant. The syntax is essentially the arrangement of words in a sentence. So you can have a disjointed syntax using em dash or parallel structure like NAFRA. And there's also the ditends, the suffix that end in ditends like polysyndeton, which is the addition of conjunctions, and asyndeton is the omission of conjunctions. And that changes the pace of the poem, the flow. And then we've got some punctuations, like commas, for example, might create tension, fragments the sentence, creates an uncertain tone. There's ellipses, which is a pause in dialogue, for example. It sometimes elicits a hesitant tone or like mystery and tension. There's also exclamations, like it accentuates the emotion, conviction. There are also like questions used in the narration, like rhetorical questions, which makes the reader reflect on the status quo. And also, of course, there are actual questions with expecting the reader to answer them. Like you can have an interrogative question and a certain question, or it might show an obsession. Who knows? And now, with regards to analysing plays, there's irony. So irony is broadly divided into three parts: verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony. So normally, verbal irony is just ordinary day-to-day sarcasm, right? The purpose is to ridicule someone, and it often generates in the reader a sense of humour. Now, situational irony is when the expectation deviates from reality, and it is often used to criticize or to ridicule someone, and which often evokes humor in the audience. So a way to analyze that is first explain the reader's expectation, and then present the writer's proposed reality, and then evaluate the effect on the reader, and then tell a bit about the purpose. And then dramatic irony is when the audience knows a piece of information that the characters on the stage don't. So, for example, in Macbeth, when Macbeth kills King Duncan, the dramatic irony creates a tense and foreboding mood because we expect other people will probably find out about the truth soon enough. But dramatic irony can also be funny and bizarre. For example, it can be used in the characterization of ignorance. And then hyperbole. What is hyperbole? Well, hyperbole is an exaggerated statement that is not intended to be taken seriously. For example, we could say the population of Earth is going to reach 1 trillion, which is not going to happen in any time soon. That is hyperbole. Oftentimes it creates a humorous tone. My example wasn't humorous, I know that. Now, let's talk a bit about paradox, juxtaposition, oxymoron, and antithesis. Those are very, very rich and advanced techniques. So paradox is something that appears to be contradictory at first glance, but then reveals some hidden truth behind the layer of contradiction. It's also mostly used to discuss complex meaning. Then there's juxtaposition, which is essentially contrast. Oxymoron versus paradox. Well, a lot of people don't know the difference. So oxymoron is the contrast of words, the juxtaposition of words, right? For example, this is going to be quite political. For example, the North Korea is known as the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. Well, we know, everyone knows that North Korea is not democratic, neither is it people's, nor is it a republic. So that is oxymoron, or the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not Roman, neither is it an empire. So that's like an oxymoron. A paradox, on the other hand, is the contrast of ideas. Now, antithesis is similar to juxtaposition, but it conveys a sense of contrast by placing two extreme things together, and is often used by the ancient Greeks, for example, in the play Antigone. And then all the techniques we've mentioned now are quite literary, which doesn't pertain to the character that much. But now we're going to talk about characterization and dialogue. So characterization is essentially a meta technique. It is a combination of the character's actions, the dialogues and thoughts of that character. So often characterization is the purpose when the text doesn't have an obvious deeper meaning. And that can be the effect of the new writer's purpose. And now dialogue is essentially a text exchange between two characters in a play, right? And is often used to construct relationships between characters, for example, like unequal relationships. And sometimes it might even characterize the speaker himself. There's internal monologue, which reveals the true thoughts of the character. There's dramatic monologue, where so in dramatic, there's another point here. So in a poem where the speaker is an identifiable character, in that case the speaker is called a persona of the poem. There's also foil characters in the play. So foil characters are a pair of characters that start out the same at the beginning and then diverge over time. Whereas juxtaposing characters are characters with different characteristics. And when it comes to advanced analysis, the difficulty here is to analyze multiple techniques together, and how when multiple techniques converge to create the same purpose and effect. So for example, step 1 would be, for example, the combined use of antithesis in Antigone and juxtaposition, blah blah blah, stuff like that. Now, having brushed over the techniques, I'm going to talk about how to perfect the writing. So for example, how to make the analysis flow. And the crucial factor here is incorporating causality in the analysis. So we should always think about how the technique causes the meaning, which causes the tone, which causes the effect on the reader. And there are actually 4 ways to create such a causal and logic flow in paragraphs. So the first way is to write slightly longer sentences. The second point is to use the concept of emphasis. For example, technique 2 sustains, further portrays a previous idea. Or you can use logical connectors like therefore, hence, or use non-causal links like in addition, stuff like that. And the reason why we want to use causal links is to deepen the analysis. So the depth of the analysis is evaluated by the number of logical steps. So for example, a shallow analysis might go from the technique being oxymoron to the purpose itself. But a deep analysis could be from the technique, oxymoron, how that contributes to the construction of diction, and how that contrasts something in the extract, and then talk about the purpose and effect. Another style of writing that I quite prefer is to make the writer active. So instead of saying this technique was used by someone, you can say the writer utilizes this technique. It's just a rule of thumb that I always use in writing good English, because we want to avoid passive forms at all costs. The next thing I want to talk about is the writer's style. Right? People might be wondering, okay, there's styles of clothes, styles of fashion. What is style in English? Well, style in English is a unique way in which the writer employs language and literary techniques. So you can think of it like a special fingerprint that sets them apart from other writers, right? And style can quite often be identified by looking at things, what stands out and what is being used repeatedly. For example, one of the texts that I'm going to use in my paper 2 in 2 days, paper 2 exam in 2 days, is the word Antigone. And one of the things that stands out is her style of the use of successive litotes. For those who don't know, litotes it's, for example, instead of saying I'm feeling happy, you might say I'm not bad, right? So her use of successive litotes in the quote, for example, Polynesians must be left unburied, unlamented, or the law is unassailable, stuff like that, right? I should probably know my quotes by now. Never mind. I think about it later. So, okay. Now, we're going to talk about, and another tip I would give is, in order to write good English, we have to sometimes avoid ambiguity, and sometimes ambiguity comes from the words like this or it without any specifying details. So avoid saying this does this or it without talking about what this specifically is, right? Now let's after talking about all those analysis and how to analyze, let's actually talk about the exam itself. So paper 1, fundamentals. So the goal of paper 1 is to answer the guiding question, right, and explain how the writer uses specific language to build a central idea, message, or purpose. So the introduction would be like on the lines, the writer does this and this to achieve that, that, and that. And the body is to prove the bold claim. And the conclusion often is about how the text impacts the reader. How does it change the reader's worldview? And often I would like to include a cheesy message about life, just to, spice things up. So whenever we're given the paper 1, there are several steps, right? First step, be calm, don't stress, don't be too nervous about it. Step 2, deconstruct the text. Break it down into logical sections, for example, in paragraph stanzas, and getting the message. So understand the broad focus of each section. For example, one section might be about setting, another section might be about constructing a fearful mood, right? And sometimes I would like to use colored pens, multicolored pens, to sort of just underline some of the words or phrases that I'd like to analyze, and then use a highlighter to highlight the quotes that I'm going to use. So that saves a lot of time. Remember to bring those two to your exam. And then step 3 is to summarize the basic idea of each section before we move on to the next one. And then step 4, repeat that process again if you can't get the message. Some useful advice are read the guiding question first before you read the text, because the guiding question is the purpose of the writer. For example, the guiding question might be, how does the writer use imagery to convey the brutality of war? Now, the purpose of that text is likely going to be the writer using imagery to convey the brutality of war, right? So that's the purpose. Next, look for patterns across the text. And then, as I said before, look for strong themes. So instead of talking about soldiers suffering from their wound, actually talk about the big picture, which is the brutality of war, instead of soldiers. And the tone is always very, very important. So in terms of the thesis statement, we want the thesis to be concise and clear, and also convey the reader's real intention. It should be no longer than 30 words. That's my recommendation. And also you want to sprinkle some of the writer's purpose. The general formula would be, in the poem extract, the writer explores some idea in order to blah, blah, blah. And you want to avoid distracting details like the technique, and those stuff. You want to mention about techniques later in the play or the extract. So in paper 1, there are multiple optimal essay structures. It depends on your preferences, but I personally like to structure by section, which provides the most logical flow in an extract. There are obviously other ways, so by like structuring by techniques or ideas or themes, stuff like that. And so now I think a lot of people want to know about the exam time management. So how long should I spend on planning? I would suggest about spending 20 minutes-ish. in planning and reserve the 55 minutes to writing, which comes down to about 15 minutes per paragraph, 5 minutes for the intro and 5 for the conclusion. And basically having 3 quotes for each point, and there's standard stuff through paragraphs. And so going back to the introduction, we want to get it done in 5 minutes. And in basic introduction, we want to have essentially 5 things, right? So the first thing is basic details about the author, the type of text, the genre. So for example, in the prose fiction extract, the author, Brian Keenan, blah, 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 right? And then we talk about the summary of the text. There's no analysis. So in the case of Brian Keenan, we can say the narrator, or I should actually say the persona, is incarcerated in a Lebanon prison before he is rescued. That's the basic summary. And then we include brief, unique, and something insightful about the big picture observation before we go into the thesis statement. And finally, we want to have an outline of the 3 points that our paragraphs are going to focus on. And now, talking about how to structure a main point. So, in a main point, we want to have a topic sentence, very clear, incorporating the writer's purpose. We want it to be very analytical, not too descriptive, which means that we're not going to talk about what did the character do, what did the narrator do, none of that. We want to get straight to the point about why the writer writes that text. And again, if there's no clear message, or if you can't spot any clear message, just substitute the writer's purpose with the effect on the reader. So for example, firstly, Shakespeare constructs the fearful character of Macbeth in order to warn the reader, something like that, on the lines of that. And then we want to analyze the quotes, which is the most important part. And after we've done our analysis, we want to have a quick 1-sentence summary and link back to the subject statement. So, for example, adding a holistic insight, and stuff like that. Okay, so now I guess paper 1 is dealt with pretty rapidly. Now I'm going to talk about paper 2. So for planning a paper 2 essay, it's advised to spend at least 20 minutes. That's my recommendation. It works for me. But I would say if you spend less than 20 minutes, you might risk a disorganized essay. So what I normally do is have an intro, body, and conclusion. So in the body, I normally have 2 umbrella points around the paper 2 prompt. Within each point, I employed the blended comparison approach, where in the first paragraph, I talk about text 1, text 2, second paragraph, text 1, text 2, third paragraph, comparison and contrast, using within the context. So for paper 2, we have to brainstorm when we see a prompt, right? So the basic way to understand the prompt is to highlight the keywords and pay attention to plurals. For example, if the prompt says one of the themes, it's not a single theme, it's plural, so you need to talk about more themes. So when it comes to crafting the thesis statement in paper 2, we want to reiterate that we're proving the thesis, proving the prompt using the thesis statement. For example, a common formula for thesis formats might be while Sophocles uses this, Arthur Miller employs that to a greater extent to achieve a similar message, and so on. So checklist would be you have to reuse the prompt's words, outline the 2 specific umbrella points, and contain 1 unique word. Like, for example, both being iconoclasts of their times, the playwrights Sophocles and Arthur Miller use blah blah. For the introduction, some common guidelines include mentioning the keyword of the prompt as soon as possible and re-engineering the keyword to give a manageable direction and justifying why that keyword can be interpreted that way. And then you want to introduce essential ideas like the audience, context, and genre. And then incorporate the 2 umbrellas into the thesis and make it engaging to earn free brownie points. We all love brownies, right? Then, in terms of the comparative analysis, when we're using the umbrella point planning, what we normally do is first focus on the analyzing the first text until an insightful point is reached, where we then come back with the second text. I'm getting quite tired now. I know, you too. It's been almost an hour listening to me talking. Let me have a look at the notes I've got and see if there are significant points. Oh yeah, so how to write a conclusion. Well, that's quite important. So you've normally got like 5 minutes max writing a conclusion. I'm not saying you would get 5 minutes if you write slowly, but you get the point. So for the conclusion, what we want is, the first step is to reiterate the prompt and the text you used, and then rephrase the thesis, and then talk about the significant comparison contrast you've made in paper 2, and then leave a defining opinion if appropriate. So that wraps up my IB English tips, specifically for the 2 exams in the next 2 days, and I hope that you are able to do your best in the exams, and good luck. Wish you good luck. And if you found the video helpful, don't forget to like it and subscribe. Thank you.